Tosh. How's everyone doing tonight? Good. The reason I wrote the book is because you'll notice I'm pretty anxious myself, so it's a really personal story for me. And as Tosh said, I've been working in youth ministry for about the last 18 years, with junior high, high school, all the way up into college. But something I really enjoy now is just having the privilege to work in a counseling ministry and to come alongside the church and to work with youth pastors and to work with parents and to work with their family. And I love doing that. So I count it a real gift tonight to be able to speak to you guys and really think the work that you are doing there in the church is just really great. And so thanks for having me here. I want to start by, as Marco said, he said, just present the here and now, which is really hard because as a counselor and therapist, I want to give answers, right? And help people. But I know when someone walks out of the door after 50 minutes that most of the time we can't fix their problems. And when it comes to this topic of being anxious, one of the things I have to tell people the most time is that we just have to sit in our anxiety. We just have to sit there. And I actually believe that God does an incredible work and uses that as a gift to help us grow, but can also do some really devastating things in our lives. And so I want to give you kind of tonight just a picture of what happens when a teen struggles with this topic of anxiety and what goes on in their life. When I was 11 years old, so 5th grade, I went back to school 2 weeks after the death of my mom from breast cancer. And I was sitting in class, and the teacher calls on me to read out loud for the first time. And if you've ever lost someone, you know it's already a very awkward and kind of self-conscious experience because people just do not know how to respond to you. And so there I am in 5th grade next to my friends and just a different person. And so she calls me to read. And as I start to read, I realize the words they stop. They get trapped in my chest. It's almost like a choking feeling. In fact, if you were sitting beside me in class, I would imagine you heard something like like this puffing, this like stuttering noise. And it's just that moment of fear for me. And that was the day that I began to stutter, when I was 11 years old. And I didn't know it then, but I know it now, looking back and going through counseling and working on my own story, is that experience, that thing that all my classmates saw, that experience of me being there, was just an experience, an outward experience of all the anxiety that I had been carrying as a kid for those 5 years. Because for 5 years, I didn't know if my mom was going to live or die. On several occasions, my dad would sit my brother and I down and say, the doctors have given your mom 1 month to live. And then a month would pass, and she wouldn't die. And then we thought things would be okay, and we'd be in this limbo. And then he'd sit us down again and say, the doctors say it's not going to go very well. She has another month to live. And then she'd live. And finally, in 1985, my dad sat my brother and I down, says the doctors have given her 1 month to live. And she actually lived a whole another year, and then passed away in 1986. But for me, that was the beginning of this journey of being anxious. And so when you're working with a teenager, and you meet them at 13, 14, 15, and 16, they're most likely carrying experience of anxiety that they have brought with them for a good part of their life. And anxiety is an interesting thing here, if I can work the clicker myself. It comes from this Latin word meaning to be angry or to have a sense of anguish. In fact, we see our Lord in the Gospel of Luke, it says they use that word of anguish when he sweats drops of blood. And it also has this connotation of this choking feeling, of a cutting off, of a narrowing, which is what I experienced that day when I literally was choking, could not produce my words. But it wasn't just about the things that you could see. There was literally a choking of who I was as a person. Because when people are anxious, it's not about the behaviors that we most often see. It's about what is going on below the surface. And the work of anxiety and what it does to our sense of purpose and identity and our sense of self, especially with teens. I think most often we think of anxiety as being something like this. It's that real or imagined threat, right? That fight or flight syndrome that we talk about with teens. And so if you think about who you work with, it might be that anxiety is experienced in a teen in all of the pressure and stress they feel to perform in school, whether it's academically or athletically, or with drama or theater or whatever. We see that. Or it might be the anxiety expressed in the form of fear or worry as there's troubles at home. Maybe mom and dad are going through a divorce, or there's difficulties, or there's conflict. Or anxiety might be experienced in the form of what we see as peer pressure How do I fit in? Where do I belong? And that's what we most often see. It's easy to see those things if we take the time to do so. And it's a huge problem. Statistically speaking, the numbers are all over the board, but the greatest numbers are that somewhere between the 18 and 20% of our population struggles with an anxiety disorder. 1 in 8 children, which is between the ages of 13 and 18, have an anxiety disorder. The National Institute of Mental Health says that 30% of teen girls have an anxiety disorder and 20% of teen boys. And these are the people who are getting help. These are the ones who've gone to the doctor, maybe got some medication. These are the ones who've gone to see a counselor. These are the ones who are in some type of treatment program. These aren't even counting all the people who just struggle with anxiety, who never talk about it, or who just go day to day wrestling with it. And so it's significant as you think about who we work with. When we look at people, it's a good chance that they are struggling under the surface with anxiety. But I think most importantly for me, and what I really want you to understand tonight, is that beyond what you and I see, the behaviors, there is some deeper work with anxiety, especially with the teen. It really attacks their sense of belief and sense of identity about who they are. Does God even have a purpose for me? My favorite definition of anxiety probably is from Soren Kierkegaard. He talks about anxiety being the dizziness of freedom, that all of a sudden when we're free to make choices in life and have responsibility, in comes the anxiety, he says. In fact, he says that in Genesis 2, when God told Adam, you are free to eat of all the trees but this one, he says that's when anxiety came into humankind. Because now Adam has to decide, do I obey God or not obey God? Therefore, here comes anxiety. And I cannot think of a more difficult time in life. For the first time, these teens are entering into this stage of life where they have all these choices and all these decisions to make. And along with that comes all this anxiety. And some of the questions I think that might be helpful for you to be thinking about is, what are they asking themselves? What are they saying to themselves? Beyond what you and I see, beyond the stress, beyond the cutting, beyond the sexual acting out, beyond the drinking, beyond those things that cover and mask the anxiety, there are deep fundamental questions I think that teens are asking about themselves. They're asking questions about their sense of identity, that who am I? Now, a teen is probably not going to say, who am I? They're not going to ask you these deep philosophical questions, but they're wondering, what does it mean to be me? Or they're asking questions about their sense of autonomy, meaning, do my choices really matter? Do I really have a say in this life? And they're asking questions about their sense of belonging. What does it mean for me to be a part of this family or to have a relationship with somebody? Do I really matter? And for us, I think most importantly, in the context of what we do here in youth ministries, there's a question of a sense of God's calling. Does God really, really have a purpose for me? Can he really use me? You see, that was the question I was asking myself as I got older. If I'm someone who stutters and I literally cannot talk, could God really, really ever use me? I don't care what people say about Moses. They can tell me all the stories they want, but can God really use me if I stutter? Right? And I avoided most of my life because I had that fear. In fact, from 5th grade all the way to college, I avoided any type of social interaction that would make me anxious. In fact, I could not wait to get to college. I heard in college you didn't have to read out loud in class. And I heard you didn't even have to go to class if you didn't want to. So for all those years, I just wanted to get to college. All those years of anxiety. And maybe this won't click over. There you go. There's this great quote by Ian Cron in one of his books. And he talks about these memories are not biodegradable. And so I want you to imagine when you work with a teenager, they have had years and years of messages that they write upon their heart when they're anxious about who they are, about do they matter, about does God have a purpose for them. And sometimes I think in youth ministry and working with teens, we think some of these things are new, and we just try to look at the behaviors and correct the behaviors. But underneath that is years and years of these beliefs. In fact, we know from the science of our brains and studying our brains that you and I basically form a rut. Somewhere between the ages of 6 and 16, when we experience certain feelings, we figure out how to cope with life. And eventually, it just becomes habit. The good news is we can change that God can help us form new habits. But when we're working with teens, they possibly have 5, 10, 15 years of these ruts and patterns in their brain that tell them this is who I am or this is who I'm not. Anxiety does a terrible work at that deep core level. And so when I work with teens, here's kind of what I imagine. I thought maybe this would be helpful for you, even though I'm not supposed to solve any problems tonight, I'm not going to, but I want to kind of give you a snapshot. When a kid is sitting across from me in the office, I usually draw some type of funnel. It's supposed to be a funnel. It's kind of a triangle. And we put anxiety at the top. And I help them identify, man, when you're anxious, what are some of the things that I see? And they'll talk about the cutting, and they'll talk about the drinking, and they'll talk about the stress and the pressure to perform, and they'll talk about trying to be perfect. And then we get to this part where we try to go below the surface. What is underneath? What are you feeling? Tell me what it's like. What is anxiety saying to you? And as you know, when you get a teen to open up, they begin to open up sometimes. And I'll hear things like, I can't do anything right, or I'm a failure. And I'll say, what does that mean? If you're a failure or you can't do anything right, what does that say to you? And they'll say, I'm inadequate, I'm unlovable. And I'll want to plunge deeper, and we'll take our time and we'll go slow. And I'll say, if you're unlovable and you're inadequate, what does that mean for you? And they'll say, I'm alone and I'm worthless. And usually by that time, there's a tear in their eye because we've hit some of that core feeling of what anxiety does in their life. And I think underneath that, in the context we work in, what I most often hear is that anxiety often tells them that somehow, if I experience these things, God doesn't love me or God doesn't accept me. I think the real challenge for us in the Christian community is this. Most kids end up in my office because some good-meaning person in the church said, well, Paul says don't be anxious, so you shouldn't be anxious. That's truth. It's gospel. What they forget to tell is that by the time Paul penned those words in the book of Philippians, he's been whipped, he's been beaten, he's been shipwrecked, he's gone starved, he's gone hungry, he's met the risen Lord on the Damascus road. He is somebody who's faced his anxiety and come to the other side. But we are dealing with teens. Most of us as adults can't do this ourselves, but we are dealing with teens who do not have that experience of life, of dealing with anxiety, and we have got to figure out a way to come alongside them in the church and to walk through those dark nights. And so why is this important for you as youth pastors and youth workers? You can do the math for yourself based on the size of your group, but in somewhere in your group, there is a large number of kids who are struggling with anxiety. If you have a group of 100 kids, probably 20 to 30 of them have some type of anxiety disorder. And probably the rest are just struggling with anxiety of what it means to be a teen. And so as I close, I want you to imagine something for me. I want you to imagine a kid in your group right now who you know probably has some type of anxiety. Can you picture that kid? And can you picture what they do when they're anxious, their behaviors? Maybe they try to be perfect, or maybe they cut, as we've mentioned, or maybe they get stressed, or they worry, or they live in fear. And as you picture that kid, I want you to think below the surface. What is that kid experiencing? What possible messages is the anxiety writing on that kid's heart? And I think if we can do that as youth workers, it will change the way that we do ministry. It will change the way that we see kids who come into our lives. Not as a problem just to be fixed and say, here's a verse and your anxiety will disappear, but how do we get into and enter into their lives and deal with anxiety at a core level? And I think for us in youth ministry, the challenge is, I think for too long, we've passed off the job to the healthcare professionals. The very questions that you and I are equipped to answer, these existential questions about identity and meaning and God's purpose, God has gifted us to walk alongside those. And often healthcare workers just deal with the behaviors. So I believe God has a purpose in it. He wants to use the gifts that you have to walk alongside a kid and to see not just the behaviors, but to see underneath those deep core messages. And if we can do that, I really believe it will change the way that we come alongside kids in youth ministry and deal with all types of problems, not just anxiety. Thanks.